The morning the stagecoach rolled into Caldwell Creek, Kansas, carrying a single woman with a carpet bag, a battered trunk, and an expression of absolute determination, Samuel Collier was elbow-deep in fence repairs and already having the worst Tuesday of his recent memory. He did not see her arrive. He would not see her until the following morning, when she knocked on the door of his ranch house with a folded letter from the town council, and a calm sort of confidence that made him forget, briefly, that he had been awake since 4 in the morning with a teething toddler and a colicky horse. But that is getting ahead of things, and this story, like most true stories, begins a little before its beginning. Samuel Collier was 31 years old in the autumn of 1878, and he had been raising his daughter entirely alone since she was 3 weeks old. Her name was Clara, and she had her mother's dark lashes and her father's stubborn chin, and she had arrived in the world during a February blizzard that had also, in the cruelest possible manner, taken her mother away from it. Samuel rarely spoke of Margaret. When people in Caldwell Creek asked, which they eventually learned not to, he would say simply that she had passed and leave it at that, his jaw tightening in a way that closed the conversation as effectively as a slammed door. What he carried inside himself was something much heavier than grief, though grief was certainly part of it. He carried guilt too, the kind that has no particular logic but settles into a man's bones regardless, convincing him that had he built the house a little closer to town, had he sent for the doctor 2 days sooner, had he done any one of 100 small things differently, she might still be alive. 3 weeks after Clara was born, Margaret died of childbed fever, and Samuel Collier, who had been a quiet man before, became a quieter one. He learned to do everything. He learned to pin diapers and warm milk and braid hair, eventually, though the braiding took him the better part of 2 years to get right. He learned to read bedtime stories in a voice that did not waver, even on nights when he sat beside Clara's little bed after she fell asleep and pressed his hands over his face and breathed very carefully for a long time. He had neighbors who helped old Martha Hicks from the farm to the east, who came twice a week with food and a willingness to hold Clara while Samuel slept for an hour, and he had the town, which was small enough and decent enough to look in on him without being intrusive about it. Clara grew. She was 4 years old now, almost 5, and she was the most talkative human being Samuel had ever encountered, which was saying something since he himself spoke less than most fence posts. She asked questions about everything. She wanted to know why the sky was blue and why horses had 4 legs and why Mr. Pemberton at the general store always smelled like peppermint, and Samuel answered every single question with the same careful seriousness he brought to all things, because he felt that a child's curiosity was a sacred thing and ought to be treated accordingly. The problem was school. Caldwell Creek had not had a schoolteacher in 14 months. Miss Hargrove, the previous occupant of the position, had married a cattle rancher from Abilene and departed in August of the previous year, taking with her the only formal education the children of the town had access to. The town council, which met in the back room of the Dusty Spur Saloon on the first Thursday of every month, had been writing letters to the Territorial Education Board ever since, and those letters had been answered with increasing bureaucratic vagueness until, at last, a reply arrived saying that a candidate had been identified and would be arriving in October. Samuel had attended the council meeting where this was discussed. He sat in the back with his hat on his knee and said nothing, because he rarely said things in public gatherings, but he listened with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. Clara would be 5 in January. In the spring, she would need to start school, and before that could happen, there needed to be a school to start. So the town waited for October, and October came, and on its second Tuesday, the stagecoach rolled down the main street of Caldwell Creek with a cloud of dust and a great deal of noise, and Edith Lawson stepped out of it and into the story. She was 26 years old, though she carried herself in a way that some people mistook for older, not because she seemed aged, but because she moved with the kind of deliberate steadiness that comes not from years, but from having made a great many difficult decisions and stuck with them. She was tall for a woman of the time, with honey-brown hair that she wore pinned up in a way that always looked as though it had begun very neatly and had since been engaged in a quiet battle with the wind, a battle it was mostly losing. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage in the morning, and they were sharp eyes, the kind that notice things. She had grown up in Ohio, the eldest of 6 children, in a household that had more love than money and more books than either, which suited her perfectly because books were the thing she cared about most in the world after people. She had attended the normal school in Columbus and had taught for 2 years in a small town outside of Cincinnati before deciding, with the same quiet boldness that characterized most of her decisions, that she wanted to go west. There was something in the wide, unwritten quality of the frontier that called to her, not the romance of it exactly, because she was too practical for romance in the abstract sense, but the sense of genuine usefulness. In the West, a schoolteacher was not simply an educator. A schoolteacher was a civilizing force, a keeper of knowledge, a builder of futures. She wanted to be that. Her mother had cried. Her father had helped her pack. She arrived in Caldwell Creek with one carpet bag containing her personal belongings, one trunk containing her books, a small collection of primers and slates she had gathered at her own expense, and a letter from the Territorial Education Board naming her as the new schoolteacher of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, at a salary of $32 a month and the use of a small room at the back of the schoolhouse. Mayor Gerald Finch met her at the stage. He was a round-faced man with a magnificent mustache and the earnest manner of someone who genuinely wanted things to go well. He shook her hand with both of his and told her that the town was very glad to have her, and that the schoolhouse had been aired out and the stove repaired, and that they were hoping to have classes begin by the 1st of November if that suited her. It suited her fine. He showed her to the schoolhouse, which was a single-room building of pale wood planks on the eastern edge of town, with 8 long benches, a blackboard that had seen better days, and a small room at the back that contained a bed, a dresser, a wood stove, and a window that looked out over open prairie that went on for what seemed like forever. Edith stood at that window for a long moment after Mayor Finch left, looking out at the grass bending in the wind, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a long time. "All right," she said aloud to nobody in particular. "Let's get to work." She spent the first 2 days organizing the schoolroom, which was more complicated than it sounds because the books that had been left behind by Miss Hargrove were in considerable disarray, and Edith had very strong feelings about the proper ordering of books. She also made a list of what was missing and what was needed, and she took that list to the general store, which was where she first encountered Mr. Pemberton and confirmed for herself that he did, in fact, smell very strongly of peppermint. On the 3rd day, she began making visits. The town council had given her a list of families with school-age children, and Edith believed in knowing the families of her students before the students ever walked through the door. It was a practice she had developed in Ohio and had no intention of abandoning. So she put on her good walking boots and her dark green wool coat, took up her small notebook, and began making calls. She visited the Hendersons first, who had 3 boys and a great deal of cheerful chaos. Then the Garcias, whose daughter Maria was 7 and had been without formal education for over a year, and looked at Edith with eyes that shone with fierce, hungry curiosity. Then the Simmons family, and the Webbers, and old widow Calloway, whose grandson had come to live with her after his parents died of a fever the previous spring. The last name on her list was Collier. Samuel Collier, ranch property east of town, 1 daughter, Clara, age 4 going on 5. No other household members noted. She walked out to the ranch the following morning because the day was clear and cold and fine, and she preferred walking to borrowing the schoolhouse's aging mule when the weather permitted. The walk took 40 minutes along a wagon road that wound between low hills covered in dry autumn grass, and she arrived at the ranch gate with pink cheeks and excellent posture and knocked at the front door of the house. Nothing happened for a moment. Then there was a small voice on the other side of the door saying, "Papa, somebody is knocking," and a deeper voice replying with a kind of resigned patience, "I know, Clara, I can hear it." The door opened. Samuel Collier was taller than she expected. He filled the doorframe in a way that was not aggressive but simply factual. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders from years of ranch work, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days of beard, and very dark brown eyes that looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read. He was wearing a heavy work shirt and trousers and boots that were dusty, and he had a small child attached to his left leg, peering out from behind it with enormous dark eyes and an expression of intense scientific interest. "Mr. Collier," Edith said, "my name is Edith Lawson. I'm the new school teacher. I'm visiting the families with school-age children before we open in November." "I hope I'm not intruding." Samuel Collier looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at Clara, who was still examining Edith from behind his leg with the focused attention of a naturalist who has discovered a new species. "You're not intruding," he said. His voice was lower than she expected too, and careful as though he measured his words before he spent them. "Come in." The inside of the house surprised her. She had not expected from the outside functional, plain, a working ranch house to find bookshelves. There were two of them, flanking the fireplace, filled with books that had clearly been read and read again. There was also a small child's rocking chair pulled up beside the larger one, and on the mantelpiece, a row of small rocks and feathers and one particularly fine piece of quartz that had obviously been gathered and arranged by a child with strong aesthetic opinions. "You like books," she said, before she could help herself. He glanced at the shelves, and something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "Clara does," he said. "I read to her every night." "Every night," Edith repeated, and felt something warm move through her that she firmly did not examine. Clara had by this point detached herself from her father's leg and was standing in front of Edith, looking up at her with an expression of profound seriousness. "Are you going to be my teacher?" she asked. "I am," Edith said, crouching down to Clara's level, which was something she always did with children because she believed it was important to meet people where they were. "That is, if you decide you would like to come to my school." Clara considered this. "Do you have lots of books?" "I brought a whole trunk of them," Edith told her, "and a blackboard, and slates so you can practice your letters." Clara turned and looked up at her father with an expression that communicated volumes. He looked back at her with a resigned expression that communicated that he had already lost whatever argument was about to occur. "Sit down, Miss Lawson," he said. "I'll make coffee." She sat at the kitchen table, which was clean and solid and bore the marks of a household that was practical about everything, and she opened her notebook and wrote down Clara's name and age and a few notes while Samuel Collier made coffee on the cast-iron stove with the efficiency of a man who had been doing it alone for a long time. Clara sat across from her and watched her write with an intensity that was almost unnerving. "What are you writing?" Clara demanded. "Your name," Edith said. "And that you are 4 years old and that you like books. Is that right?" "Almost 5, Clara corrected, with a seriousness that suggested this distinction was extremely important. "My birthday is in January, the 14th. "I will note that as well," Edith said gravely. Samuel set a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table, and Edith explained the school schedule classes 5 days a week, beginning at 8 in the morning and ending at 3 in the afternoon, with a midday break for lunch. She explained what she would be teaching: reading and writing, arithmetic, some history, some geography. She explained that she would need Clara to have a slate and a dinner pail and boots that fastened properly. He listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me as a parent?" The question caught her slightly off guard. In her experience, fathers, when they were present at all for these conversations, tended to nod along and let their wives handle the details. Samuel Collier was asking a focused, specific question and waiting for an answer. "Consistency," she said. "Children learn best when they come regularly. And if you have any concerns about what Clara is learning or how she is getting on, I want you to bring them to me directly rather than to the town council." A slight, brief expression crossed his face that she thought might have been amusement. "Noted," he said. She finished her coffee and gathered her notebook and stood to go. Clara walked her to the door and stood in it, watching her with those enormous dark eyes, and said, "Will there be other children?" "Yes," Edith said. "Quite a few. You'll make friends." Clara absorbed this information and then said, with the gravity of a much older person, "I don't have very many of those." Edith looked up and found Samuel standing just behind his daughter, and the expression on his face in that moment was something she filed away without examining too closely, a raw, unguarded thing, there and gone in an instant, the face of a man who heard that sentence and felt it somewhere deep. "You'll have them soon," Edith said to Clara. "I promise." She walked back to town in the clear autumn air and thought about the books on the shelves and the child's rocking chair and the row of rocks and feathers on the mantelpiece. And she thought about a man who made careful coffee and asked focused questions. And she looked firmly at the road ahead and kept walking. The school opened on the 1st of November, 1878, with 11 children aged 5 through 13 seated on the 8 long benches, which meant some creative arrangement was necessary. Edith had spent the preceding 2 weeks getting the room into the best order she could manage on her budget. She had hung a large map of the United States on the wall beside the blackboard, and she had arranged her books along the windowsill where the children could see them and be tempted by them, which was a deliberate strategy. Clara Collier arrived on the first morning with her father. He tied his horse at the post outside and walked her in himself, which several of the other fathers had also done, and Edith greeted each child at the door by name, which she had memorized from her notes. She crouched down and said good morning to Clara, who was wearing a new dress someone had made it recently. She could see by the freshness of the fabric and a very serious expression. "Are you nervous?" Edith asked her quietly. Clara considered. "A little," she admitted. "Papa said it would be all right." "Your papa is correct," Edith said. When she straightened up, Samuel was standing a few feet away, holding his hat in both hands, and she had the impression that he was also a little nervous, which she found unexpectedly touching in a man that large and that quiet. "She'll be fine, Mr. Collier," Edith said. "I'll take good care of her." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, careful eyes. "I know," he said. And then he said, "Thank you, Miss Lawson." And it came out with a weight that suggested he meant considerably more than a polite pleasantry, and he put his hat on and walked out. The first week of school was the kind of organized chaos that always comes with beginnings. Edith managed it with her usual combination of warmth and very firm expectations, because she believed that children needed to understand that a classroom had rules, and that understanding those rules was the first and most important thing to learn. By the end of the week, all 11 children knew where to sit and how to address her, and what the signal was for quiet, and 6 of them were already trying to read the books on the windowsill when they thought she wasn't looking. Clara was one of the 6. She was also, Edith quickly realized, extremely bright, the kind of bright that needed careful handling, because it came with a fierce impatience when things moved too slowly and a tendency to barrel ahead, and then get frustrated when she made mistakes. Edith recognized the pattern because she had been the same kind of child herself. At the end of the second week, Samuel came to collect Clara on a Friday afternoon and arrived slightly early, and found Edith sitting beside Clara at one of the long benches, the 2 of them bent over a primer together. Clara was reading aloud, slowly and carefully, sounding out each word with her whole body, and Edith was listening with the complete, unhurried attention that is the rarest and most valuable thing a teacher can offer. He stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. He watched his daughter read, and his expression was the kind that should not be seen by anyone too open, too undefended, too full of something that he had kept contained for a long time. Edith looked up and saw him, and something in her face changed too, very slightly, before she turned back to Clara and said, "Your papa is here. Shall we read this last page tomorrow?" Clara looked up and saw her father, and immediately the reading was forgotten, because she had things to tell him, important, urgent things about Maria Garcia, and the piece of quartz she had brought for the nature shelf, and the song Miss Lawson had taught them, and the arithmetic problem she had figured out before anyone else. She talked all the way to the door, and Samuel listened to all of it with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything, asking questions in the right places, and Edith watched them go and stood in the empty schoolroom for a moment afterward, in the quiet. She was doing very well at not thinking about it. She was going to continue doing very well at not thinking about it. November moved forward. The weather turned sharply colder, and the prairie outside Edith's window was silver with frost in the mornings. She fell into a routine that suited her well. The mornings were for teaching, the evenings were for preparation and letter writing and reading, and the afternoons between were for the 100 small administrative tasks that came with running a school on a limited budget in a frontier town. She had made friends in Caldwell Creek. She liked Mayor Finch, who was genuinely well-intentioned even when he was flustered, and she had developed a warm friendship with Ruth Garcia, Maria's mother, who was a practical, funny woman who invited Edith to Sunday dinners with a generosity that Edith accepted gratefully, because the schoolhouse room was comfortable but the cooking facilities were limited. She had also developed a respectful acquaintance with Martha Hicks, the older woman who lived east of the Collier ranch, who came into town on Thursdays and always stopped by the schoolhouse to check on things, and who told Edith, one afternoon in mid-November, that Samuel Collier had not had a conversation with anyone that lasted more than 5 minutes since his wife died. "He talks to Clara," Martha amended, wrapping her shawl more tightly. "And he talks to his horses, though he would never admit to that. But people," she shook her head. "He shut himself up. It's been 4 years and he is still shut up." Edith said nothing about this because it was not her business, but she thought about it later, alone in her room with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. He came on Fridays to collect Clara. That much was consistent. But toward the end of November, something changed, which was that Clara began to have questions on Friday afternoons that Edith could not answer without her books, and her books were in the schoolroom. And so Clara would ask these questions at the door, and Samuel would be standing there waiting, and the questions would turn into conversations, because Edith had never in her life been able to resist a genuine question, and Samuel, it turned out, had never been able to resist a genuine answer. The first real conversation they had lasted 20 minutes. It began with a question from Clara about why the stars were different in winter than in summer, and it turned into a conversation about the Earth's orbit that Edith illustrated with a book and a candle, and Samuel sat at one of the long benches because Clara had climbed into his lap and refused to move, and Edith stood at the blackboard and drew the sun and the earth and the tilted axis, and when she turned around, she found that both of them were watching her with the same focused expression. The same dark eyes, the same slight forward lean of someone who is genuinely interested in what is being said. She turned back to the blackboard to hide whatever was on her face. "So the stars do not actually move," Samuel said. "We do," Edith confirmed. He said, and it was the thoughtful kind of sound, the kind that means a person is placing a new piece of information carefully into their mental architecture. She liked that sound more than was strictly sensible. He thanked her, and Clara said goodbye by hugging Edith's arm with both of hers and then running ahead to the horse, and Samuel put his hat on and said, "Good evening, Miss Lawson," in that low, careful voice. "Good evening, Mr. Collier," she said. The second conversation happened the following Friday and lasted 30 minutes, and was about the history of the territories, which Clara had asked about after they studied the map. The third conversation happened on a Tuesday because Clara had a question that could not wait until Friday, apparently, and Samuel had brought her to school and stayed to ask it on her behalf. And that one lasted nearly an hour and covered, in no particular order, the Oregon Trail, the proper way to treat a book spine, and whether it was true that coyotes could find water by smell. By the fourth conversation, which happened on a Friday evening in early December, with snow beginning to come down outside the schoolroom windows and the stove going well and Clara asleep on two pushed-together benches in the corner, because she had insisted on hearing one more story, and then fallen asleep in the middle of it, Edith and Samuel had stopped calling each other Miss Lawson and Mr. Collier. She was not sure exactly when that happened. One of those things that shifts without announcement. "She does this at home," Samuel said quietly, looking at his sleeping daughter. "Falls asleep in the middle of the thing she was most insistent about doing." "She is very persistent," Edith agreed. "She is exactly like her mother," he said, and then stopped, as though he had not meant to say it, and looked at the window. The snow came down in the silence. "Tell me about her," Edith said, very quietly, because she had the instinct, the strong, specific instinct of someone who has listened carefully to many people, that this was something he needed to say rather than something she was entitled to hear. He was quiet for a long time. She did not push. She had learned, over the course of their conversations, that Samuel Collier's silences were not empty. They were where he kept things while he decided what to do with them. "Margaret was from Missouri," he said at last. "She came west with her family when she was 16. I met her when she was 19 and I was 22, and I married her 8 months later because she told me she was planning to homestead the East Ridge whether I helped her or not, and I decided it would be better to help her." A pause. She was funny. She was stubborn. She had absolutely no fear of anything practical and a profound fear of mice, which she considered deeply unreasonable and was embarrassed about. Edith looked at him. He was looking at his hands resting loosely on the table. "She sounds wonderful," Edith said. "She was," he said, simply, finally, without qualification. Another silence, and then he said, "I have not talked about her to anyone except Clara, and Clara was too small to remember the stories." "It is good to say things aloud sometimes," Edith said, "even the things that are hard." He looked at her then directly for a moment that was longer than his usual measured glances. "Yes," he said, "I think that's right." Clara stirred and did not wake, and Samuel stood and gathered her carefully. She was small enough still that he could carry her without difficulty, settled against his shoulder with the boneless trust of sleeping children, and Edith held the door while he walked out into the snow. And she stood in the doorway and watched him go to his horse and settle Clara in the saddle in front of him and ride away through the falling white, and the cold air on her face felt like a clarifying thing. Like a word in a language she was only beginning to learn, December deepened. There was a Christmas program at the schoolhouse, which Edith organized with the help of the town council, and which turned into a genuine community event, with half of Caldwell Creek crowded into the small room to watch 11 children perform a nativity play that had been, through a series of negotiations, adapted to include a shepherdess, 2 extra wise men, and a camel that was represented by Tommy Henderson in a brown blanket on all fours. Clara played Mary, which she had campaigned for with the same single-minded intensity she brought to everything she wanted. She stood at the front of the room in a blue cloth headscarf that Edith had found in the bottom of the costume box and recited her 3 lines with an authority that made several adults in the audience exchange smiling glances. Samuel sat in the second row and watched his daughter, and Edith, standing to one side to manage the proceedings, found her eyes going to him more than once and found him, once, already looking at her. She looked back at the children. He looked back at the stage. The play continued. After the program there were refreshments, and the schoolroom was warm and full of noise and laughter, and Edith moved through it all saying the right things to the right people, and making sure the gingerbread that Ruth Garcia had brought was properly distributed, and eventually she found herself in the corner near the bookshelves with a cup of cider and a moment of relative quiet. Samuel appeared beside her. He had Clara on his shoulders, which was her preferred elevation at social gatherings because it gave her an excellent view of everything. He was holding a cup of cider too, and he stood beside Edith in the comfortable way they had developed over the past several weeks, the way of two people who have discovered they do not need to fill every silence. "She did well," Edith said, looking up at Clara. "She practiced that second line 400 times," Samuel said. "I have it memorized." "Only 3 lines," Clara said from above them, looking down with a benevolent air. "I wanted more, but Miss Lawson said Mary did not have more lines than that in the Bible and it would not be accurate." "That is correct," Edith confirmed, with great solemnity. "I think Mary probably said more things than what was written down," Clara said, with a tone that suggested she felt this was a missed opportunity on the Bible's part. Samuel looked sideways at Edith, and the corner of his mouth moved very slightly upward. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it did something to the inside of her chest that she had been very carefully not thinking about for several weeks. "She has a point," he said. "She always has a point," Edith said. "She gets that from somewhere." He looked at her when she said that. He did not say anything, but his expression was the open, unguarded one that came occasionally and went quickly, and she felt that she had said exactly the right thing, and also, perhaps, a great deal more than she had intended. The Christmas holiday came, and the school closed for 2 weeks. Edith wrote letters home to Ohio and received letters back, and she read through her entire stack of books and started on a second reading of the ones she liked best, and she walked out across the prairie on the clear, cold days and let the enormousness of the land be what it was. She had a standing invitation from Ruth Garcia for Christmas dinner, which she accepted. She spent a loud and cheerful afternoon with the Garcia family and walked home in the blue winter evening with a belly full of good food and a heart that was, on reflection, considerably fuller than it had been when she arrived in Caldwell Creek. On the day after Christmas, there was a knock at the schoolhouse door. She opened it and found Samuel Collier on the step with Clara beside him, both of them slightly pink from the cold, and Clara holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "We made you something," Clara announced. "I helped. Well, Papa made it and I watched and gave advice." Samuel held out the package. "Happy Christmas," he said. His voice was even quieter than usual, and something about his posture suggested that this had required some doing. Edith took the package and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully made, with smooth sanded sides and a fitted lid, and carved along the top in careful, deliberate strokes was an open book. It was the kind of work that takes patience and practice and a genuine care for the thing being made. "It's for your important papers," Clara explained helpfully. "Or your pencils, or your small rocks if you collect those. I collect those." "I know you do," Edith said. She was looking at the box, and then she looked up at Samuel, and whatever showed in her face in that moment made him look away at some point over her shoulder, his jaw working slightly. "Thank you," she said, "both of you. This is the most thoughtful gift I have received in a very long time." "Papa spent a week on it," Clara said, in the tone of someone sharing important factual information. "Clara," Samuel said, without heat. "It's true," Clara said reasonably. Edith set the box very carefully on the table beside her. "Come in for a moment," she said. "I have something for you both too." She had not bought her students Christmas gifts. She could not afford to do that for 11 children, but she had bought Clara a book. It was a collection of nature illustrations with descriptions beside each one, the kind of book that was exactly right for a child who collected rocks and feathers and asked questions about everything. She had bought it from the general store in the middle of November, and had told herself it was a purely educational decision, and had believed herself for approximately 1 week. She gave it to Clara, who took it with both hands and immediately sat down on the floor to look at it, and Edith stood up and found that Samuel was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, warm and direct, and without his usual careful reserve, and the air in the room was very still. "That was kind," he said. "She is very easy to be kind to," Edith said. "She thinks the world of you," he said. And then, after a slight pause that felt as deliberate as everything else he did, "So do I, Edith." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it. She had done the same for him weeks ago, but he had been slower, more careful, more deliberate, as he was with everything, and hearing it now, just her name, plainly, in that low, careful voice, was something she had not prepared herself for. "Samuel," she said, which was also the first time and was not nothing. He nodded once, as though something had been acknowledged between them, and then Clara looked up from the floor and said, "Papa, look, it has a picture of a prairie dog and it says they are not actually dogs." And the moment passed into the ordinary texture of the afternoon, but it left something behind it, something that stayed in the room after they left, something Edith sat with in the quiet of the winter evening with the wooden box on the table beside her. January came. Clara turned 5 on the 14th, and Edith led the class in a rendition of a birthday song that Clara received with dignified pleasure, as though it were her due, which made her sound more like royalty than she probably intended. Samuel came that evening. She had invited him for a birthday supper, along with Martha Hicks and Ruth Garcia, a small gathering that Clara had approved after consultation, and they ate around the table in the schoolhouse kitchen, which was cramped and warm and full of noise and better for it, and Clara fell asleep in her chair at 7:30 with a piece of cake still in her hand. Samuel carried her to the borrowed cot, and Edith followed with a blanket, and they tucked her in together in the small back room and stood for a moment in the doorway of the dark room looking at her. 5 years old, Samuel said very quietly. "She is doing wonderfully," Edith told him. "At school, at reading, at numbers, at everything. She is one of the brightest children I have taught," he breathed. "Her mother would have liked that." "Tell me more about Margaret sometime," Edith said. "When you want to. I think she deserves to be talked about." He looked at her. The kitchen light came through the doorway and caught half his face, and he was not guarded in that moment at all. "All right," he said. "I think you're right." They went back to the kitchen, and Ruth and Martha were putting on their coats to go, and the small party disbanded into the cold night, and Samuel shook her hand at the door, a formal thing, the handshake. But the way his hand closed around hers was not formal at all, not quite, and he held it a moment longer than a handshake strictly required. "Thank you, Edith," he said, "for today, for all of it." "Happy birthday to Clara," she said. He smiled. It was a real one this time. Not just the architecture of one but the whole construction, and it changed his face so completely that she had to look away at the snowy yard, because otherwise she would have done something inadvisable. February was cold. The children came to school bundled in every article of clothing they owned, and Edith kept the stove going all day and taught arithmetic and reading and geography, and tried not to think about the fact that Samuel Collier had started coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays as well as Fridays, always with some ostensible reason. He needed to speak with her about Clara's progress. He was returning a book she had lent him. He was in town for supplies and thought he would see how things were. And that these visits had stopped being about Clara some time ago, and they both knew it. She liked his company. She liked it in a specific, detailed way, like the way he listened, which was the whole attention kind of listening that makes a person feel actually heard. Like the way he engaged with ideas, carefully and seriously, but not without humor. Liked that he had a wry humor under all that reserve that came out in small, precise observations that made her laugh in a way she felt in her chest. She liked that he asked her questions about Ohio, and about her teaching and about the books she had read, and that when she answered, he did not nod politely and move on but actually engaged with what she had said. She also liked, if she was honest with herself, the way he looked when he was tired and had forgotten to be careful, the way the quiet on his face deepened into something that was simply itself, without performance. She liked the scar on his left hand from an old fence wire cut, and the way he held a coffee cup as though its warmth was something he needed rather than just a beverage. She liked him, thoroughly and specifically, in the detailed way that does not happen quickly. She was very careful about this. She had a position and a reputation and a responsibility to the children in her care and to the community that had employed her, and she was not going to make anything complicated. And then the blizzard came in the middle of February. It came fast, as the worst ones do, a clear morning that turned gray by noon and white by 2 o'clock, with wind driving the snow in horizontal sheets that reduced visibility to nearly nothing. She called school early and sent the children home, making sure each of them was wrapped adequately and that the older ones were paired with the younger ones for the walk. She stood at the schoolhouse door and watched them go and then went back inside and built up the fire and looked out her window at the weather and thought, with a sudden sharp anxiety, about the fact that Clara had left an hour before the storm with her father and that the road to the Collier ranch was 40 minutes on a good day. She told herself they were fine. They had left before the worst of it. Samuel was not a careless man. She spent the rest of the afternoon by the stove, reading and listening to the wind scream against the walls, and she was fine. She was entirely fine. She was just reading her book. There was a knock at the door at 4:30, and she opened it, and Samuel was there, covered in snow, his horse behind him at the post. "Clara is at Martha's," he said. His face was reddened from the cold, and he was brushing snow from his coat. "I sent her there when it turned. Martha is closer to our road, and she will be warm and safe." Edith exhaled. "Good, come in. You cannot ride back out in this." He hesitated at the door in the precise way of a man who is aware of propriety and has opinions about it. "Samuel," she said, in the tone she used for students who were being stubborn about things for no good reason, "get inside before you lose any fingers." He came inside. She hung his coat by the stove and gave him coffee, and they sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table and listened to the storm and really talked, the way they had been getting close to for weeks, about things they had not quite gotten to yet, about what he had wanted for his life before Margaret died and what he had built instead, which was different and harder and also, he said quietly, with more value in some ways than he had expected. About what Edith wanted, which she had not said aloud to anyone recently. She wanted to stay in Caldwell Creek, she said, and was surprised to hear herself say it, because she had not been certain of it until it came out of her mouth. She had thought she would stay a year, maybe 2, and then move on to somewhere larger, but there was something here that she did not want to leave. He looked at her when she said that, and she looked back at him, and the storm howled outside, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I am glad you came here," he said. "I am very glad you came, Edith." "So am I," she said. He set his coffee cup down. He was looking at his hands on the table, and then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and a little afraid and also very, very decided. "I should say something," he said. "I have been trying to work out when the right moment is, and I have concluded there is no right moment. There is only the moment, and I would rather say it than not say it." Her heart was doing something loud and inconvenient in her chest. "Say it," she said. "I care for you," he said, "in a way that is not in a way that is significant to me. I know you have your life here and your work, and I know things are not simple, and I am not asking you to do anything about it. I just thought you should know it. Because you deserve to know it." The wind pushed against the walls of the little schoolhouse, and the fire crackled in the stove, and Edith looked at Samuel Collier across the kitchen table and thought about how she had come here for a teaching position and had found, along the way, something she had not been looking for and had not known she was missing. "Samuel," she said, "I have been trying to not say something for about 2 months." He looked at her. "I care for you too," she said, "in exactly the way you mean." He breathed, slow and careful. And then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Would you permit me to court you properly if that is something you would want?" The formality of it caught her somewhere between tender and delighted. "Yes," she said, "I would want that very much." He nodded once with the gravity of a man who has just completed a transaction of the highest possible importance. And then the corner of his mouth turned up, and then the rest of his face followed, and it was the smile from January but bigger, and she laughed because it was so good, and he looked surprised, and then he laughed too, which was a sound she had not heard from him before, low and warm, and the storm outside could do whatever it liked. He stayed the night on the bench by the stove with a blanket from the supply cupboard, because the storm did not break until past midnight, and it was entirely proper and very calm, and in the morning the world was white and brilliant, and she made coffee, and he shoveled out the door and fetched Clara from Martha's, who sent them back with a basket of biscuits and an expression that said she had seen this coming from some distance. Clara, it should be said, received the information that her father was courting her teacher with the calm confidence of a child, who has arranged for exactly this outcome through a series of questions and invitations that were perhaps not entirely accidental. "I liked you from the very first day," she told Edith, when Samuel had stepped outside to see to his horse and the two of them were alone in the schoolroom. "I liked you too," Edith said. "Good," Clara said with satisfaction. "That is how it should be." Courtship in Caldwell Creek in 1879 was a relatively public affair, in the sense that a town of 300 people did not offer a great deal of privacy, and everyone knew everyone's business, and the business of the schoolteacher and the quiet widower from the East Ranch was noted with almost universal approval. Mayor Finch said, when Edith came in with the school supply list in March, that it was wonderful news. Ruth Garcia hugged her. Martha Hicks, when Edith stopped by on a Saturday afternoon, gave her a look of great satisfaction and fed her apple cake. The only person who made any difficulty was Gerald Warren, who owned the livery stable and who had apparently had his own intentions regarding the new schoolteacher, and who made one ill-considered remark about it at the saloon that was relayed to Samuel by 3 separate people within 48 hours. Samuel went to have a conversation with Gerald Warren that no one else witnessed, and afterward Gerald Warren was civil whenever Edith passed, which was sufficient. Samuel came to the schoolhouse on Tuesday evenings and Thursday evenings, when Clara was in bed at Martha's. She had taken to staying 1 or 2 nights a week with Martha, who was delighted with the arrangement and treated it as the most natural thing in the world, and they read together and talked and sat by the stove, and he brought her things, small things. A jar of honey from his neighbor's bees, a book he had found in a box in the attic that he thought she might not have, wildflowers from the edge of the ridge that he had thought of her when he saw. She kept the flowers until they dried and then pressed them between the pages of her Street book, which was not something she had ever done before for anyone. He also began, gradually and without announcement, to repair things. The hinge on the school storeroom that had never quite sat right, the loose board on the front step that made a noise that troubled him every time he walked across it, the window in her room at the back that let in a draft. He did these things without making a production of them, simply showing up one morning with the right tools and fixing what was broken, and Edith watched him from across the room with an expression she did not bother to hide and felt warm clear through. In April, on a Sunday that was the first genuinely warm day of the year, he took her riding. She had ridden before in Ohio, though not frequently, and he rode beside her on the trail that went up along the east ridge above the ranch, where you could see the whole of the valley laid out below, the town small and clear in the late afternoon light, the farms and ranches scattered across the plain, the sky so enormous above all of it that it seemed less like a sky and more like a fundamental condition of existence. She pulled up her horse at the top and looked out at it all. "This is why you stayed," she said. "Not a question. Part of it," he said beside her. She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, and the light was on the side of his face, and he was exactly himself, unguarded, present, thoroughly and completely there in the way he had been with her for months now, the careful reserve replaced by something much more valuable. She had grown very attached to this specific person, in this specific landscape, in a way that felt like it had been growing since the moment she knocked on his door in October, and he had filled the doorframe and looked at her with those dark, reading eyes. "Samuel," she said. "Edith," he said, turning to look at her. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it today. It came out as the most natural thing, just the truth, arriving in the afternoon light like the rest of the landscape. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, the one not holding the reins, and held it with both of his and said, "I love you too. I have loved you since I cannot tell you exactly when it started. It was before I knew what I was feeling and after I knew it for certain." She squeezed his hand. "That is a good description," she said. "I am better at feelings than words," he said, which made her laugh because it was so completely false. He was extraordinarily precise with words, just economical. "You are not," she said, still laughing. "You are very good with words, you just spend them carefully." He said, the thoughtful kind. And then, "Edith, I want to ask you something." "Ask me." "Will you marry me?" Not a question exactly, because he had the quiet certainty of a man who has considered a thing for a long time and arrived at a conclusion, but also a question because he was not a man who assumed. She looked at him in the afternoon light on the east ridge with the whole valley below them and the enormous Kansas sky above, and she thought about the carpet bag and the trunk of books, and the morning she had stepped off the stagecoach into a life she hadn't finished imagining yet. "Yes," she said. "I will. Absolutely I will." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was the most formal and the most sincere gesture she had ever had directed at her, and she felt it all the way to her feet. Then he said, "Clara is going to have opinions about the wedding." "She is going to have opinions about everything for the rest of her life," Edith said. "I would not change that." "No," he agreed. "Neither would I." They rode down from the ridge in the long spring light, and the horses found their way home easily, the way horses do when they know where home is. Clara was told that evening. She sat across the kitchen table from both of them with her arms folded and a very serious expression, and Edith had the slightly alarming impression of being interviewed. "You are going to live with us," Clara said to Edith. It was more statement than question. "Yes," Edith said. "And you are going to keep being my teacher." "I intend to keep teaching, yes. We will discuss the arrangement with the town council to make sure everyone is comfortable." Clara absorbed this. "Can I call you Mama?" she said. The word fell into the room like a stone into water, spreading in all directions. Edith looked at Samuel. He was looking at Clara with an expression that could not be contained by his usual reserve, something so full it seemed to press at the edges of his face. "Clara," he said. "I know," Clara said patiently. "My real mama is in heaven, I know. She frowned at the table, and for a moment she was very young, the 5-year-old she was rather than the small adult she so often seemed to be. I would just like to have one here too, if that is all right." Edith's throat tightened. She said very carefully, "If you want to and when you want to, it would be an honor, Clara." Clara looked at her father. He nodded, not trusting his voice by the look of it. "All right," Clara said, with the finality of a matter decided. "Then that is settled." The town council had a brief and ultimately enthusiastic meeting about whether the schoolteacher could continue in her position after marriage, which was more of a question in some territories than others. Mayor Finch, who was firmly in favor of keeping Edith regardless of her marital status, because finding another good teacher had taken 14 months, and he was not about to repeat that experience, argued the case with surprising vigor, and the motion passed 4-1, with Gerald Warren casting the dissenting vote for reasons that were transparent to everyone. They were married in June, on a Saturday, in the small white church at the center of Caldwell Creek, which held all 300 of the town's residents, and a good number from the surrounding farms and ranches besides. Edith wore a dress of white cotton with small blue flowers embroidered along the collar, which she had made herself over the preceding weeks with help from Ruth Garcia, who was a much better seamstress, and whose help Edith was extremely grateful for even if she did not always follow advice. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers from the East Ridge that Samuel had brought her that morning. Samuel wore his good coat and his best boots and had shaved very carefully and cut his hair. And when Edith walked down the aisle of the small church on Mayor Finch's arm, her father could not make the journey from Ohio in time, but had written a letter of such warmth and generosity that she had cried over it 3 separate times. Samuel's face, when he saw her, was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, fully open, absolutely present, without a trace of his habitual reserve. Clara was the flower girl. She took this responsibility with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything, walking ahead of Edith with a small basket of flower petals, and distributing them with the deliberate precision of a small person who has been told one time how this is done, and is determined to do it correctly. They said their vows in the simple language of the time, and when the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," and Samuel kissed her brief and warm, and with both hands cupped around her face, as though she were something he was taking very good care of, the church erupted in the kind of noise that only comes when a whole community has been rooting for something. Clara threw the rest of her petals. They went back to the ranch, which was home now, Edith's home as well as Samuel's, and the house that had been quiet for 4 years was not quiet anymore. She brought her books and her trunk and the wooden box with the carved book on its lid, and she put them alongside his, and the house, which had always been functional and purposeful, became something warmer and less careful, full of more voices and more laughter and the constant, beautiful noise of Clara, who had opinions about where everything should go and expressed them freely. Summer passed on the ranch in the way of summers in Kansas, large and hot and full of work, but also full of evenings on the porch where the air cooled and the sky turned colors that seemed almost excessive, too beautiful to be real, and they sat together in the quiet of the evening and talked about small things and large things and sometimes not at all, because they had become the kind of people who could sit together in silence and have it mean nothing bad. Edith continued to teach. She made modifications to the school schedule to account for the distance from the ranch, leaving on the ranch horse in the early morning and returning in the late afternoon, and Samuel hired a girl from town to come in the mornings and watch Clara until school started, though Clara considered this unnecessary and said so repeatedly. The town council did not renew any objections. The children's academic progress that year was the best Caldwell Creek had seen in a generation, which made their objections difficult to sustain regardless. Clara was in Edith's class, which had required some conversation about boundaries and expectations, and Clara had listened to the conversation and agreed to all terms, and then spent the school year being simultaneously Edith's most enthusiastic student and her most challenging one, which was entirely consistent with her character. In the fall, which was their first full autumn as a married household, Edith told Samuel on a Tuesday evening after supper that she thought there was going to be a baby. He was washing up at the basin with his back to her, and he went very still. Then he turned around. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "Not entirely, but fairly." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something layered and complex, joy and fear and love, and something old in it, some shadow of the time he had sat beside another woman and heard similar words and had not known then what would follow. She put her hands over his. "I am healthy and strong," she said quietly, "and I am going to be fine." He breathed. "And when I am not fine," she said, "because that is also possible, I am going to tell you, and we will get the doctor from Abilene well in advance, and I am not going to die, Samuel. I intend to be around for a very long time." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I need you to be," he said very low. "I know," she said. "So do I." Clara, when told she was going to have a brother or sister, received the news with appropriate gravity and then immediately began lobbying for a sister, on the grounds that there were already too many boys in her class and she was, she said, tired of the balance of things. The doctor came from Abilene in November and confirmed what Edith already knew, and he was a good doctor, careful and thorough and respectful, in a way that not all doctors of the time troubled to be. and he gave her a regime of rest and moderate activity that she followed with more discipline than Samuel had expected, because Edith was extremely sensible about most things except her own tendency to overwork. Samuel built a cradle. He built it in the evenings in the barn by lamplight, with the same patient care he brought to every piece of wood he touched, and he finished it in December and brought it inside and set it by the fireplace, and Edith sat in her chair and looked at it for a long time. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's good enough," he said, in the way of a craftsman who is pleased with something but too proud to say so. "It is beautiful," she said firmly, and he sat down in his chair beside hers and they sat by the fire and she reached over and took his hand, and outside the Kansas winter did what it would, and inside they were warm. The baby was born in March of 1880, a boy, healthy and loud, with a great deal of dark hair and the same determined chin that seemed to be the Collier family's primary contribution to its members. The doctor was there, and Ruth Garcia, who had insisted on being present, and Martha Hicks, who had driven over through the early spring mud and was in the kitchen making enough food for an army. Samuel stayed close the entire time, holding Edith's hand when she needed it and staying out of the way of the doctor when the doctor needed that, and he was pale and very quiet through the long hours of labor. And when the baby finally arrived and cried and was healthy and Edith was pale but also fine, entirely fine, exactly as she had promised, he pressed his face against her hair and said nothing at all for a long time. Clara, who had been confined to the kitchen with Martha, burst through the bedroom door the moment it opened. "Is it a sister?" she demanded. "It is a brother," Samuel said, and he was holding the baby, and his voice was, there was no word for what his voice was. Clara looked at the baby with a complicated expression. "Well," she said after a moment, "I suppose I can manage that." They named him James. James Margaret Collier. The middle name was Edith's suggestion, and Samuel looked at her when she said it and nodded once, and that was that. James was a different kind of child than Clara. Where Clara had been focused and intense and verbal from the first moment, James was loud about certain things and deeply calm about others, and he had a smile that arrived early and was deployed frequently, and with great effect on everyone around him. Clara regarded him in the first weeks with the scientific interest she brought to all new phenomena, and then, gradually, with something much more personal, and Edith watched her stepdaughter fall in love with her brother with the same quiet satisfaction she felt watching most things grow. The school year of 1880 was Edith's third year of teaching in Caldwell Creek. She had 17 students now, because the town had grown, a new family of homesteaders from Illinois, another from Tennessee, and the Reeves family who had come down from Colorado looking for better land. She needed a second bench, and had lobbied the town council for it with the same firm pleasantness she brought to all administrative negotiations, and got it, along with a small increase in her salary and a promise to repair the roof before winter. Samuel came into town on those evenings when her teaching ran long, sometimes with James on his hip and Clara trotting beside him, and people in Caldwell Creek had stopped noticing the specificity of it. The quiet rancher and his lively daughter and the school teacher and their baby, because it had become as much a part of the landscape as the church and the general store. Some things settle into a place so naturally that it becomes impossible to remember the place without them. Martha Hicks died in the summer of 1881, quietly in her sleep, which was the kindest possible way, and they buried her in the churchyard under an elm tree, and Samuel stood at the graveside in the summer heat with his hat in his hands and Clara pressed against his side, and Edith stood on his other side with James on her hip and her other hand in his, and she felt the weight of what this place had given him, the years of quiet, steadfast neighborliness that had kept him and his daughter functional in the hardest time of their lives. And she was grateful for Martha in the way you can only be grateful for someone who kept something going until you could get there to take over. They planted a rose bush on Martha's property that fall, just for its own sake, because she had loved roses and the land was standing empty now, and Edith thought someone ought to remember. In 1882, there was a matter with the Hendersons' oldest boy, Tom, who was 15 and had gotten into some trouble, not serious trouble, not the kind that would follow him, but the kind that comes from a boy with too much energy and too little direction. Samuel went and talked with him, not as a moral authority, but as a man who had been 15 once and understood the particular feeling of too much inside a too small space. He helped Tom get on at a local cattle operation for the summer, physical work with responsibility attached to it. And by fall, Tom Henderson was a different kind of 15, more settled, with something to be proud of, and his mother thanked Samuel with tears in her eyes. Edith watched her husband do things like this, quiet, practical acts of care for people who needed them, and loved him each time in a new specific way, adding to the total. Clara turned 8 in January of 1883, and she was reading at a level that made Edith seriously consider what to do about the limitations of the frontier education system. They had been writing letters back and forth with a teacher in Abilene about the possibility of correspondence coursework, and the correspondence teacher, a woman named Dr. Harriet Flynn, who held the distinction of being one of the first women to hold a doctoral degree in education in the territory, had written back with such enthusiasm that the arrangement was settled by spring. Clara received her additional coursework with enormous satisfaction and told her father at supper one evening that she intended to go to university, which was a thing that required some navigation in the 1880s for a girl, but Edith had opinions about navigation. "We will make it happen," Edith told her. "It will not be simple, but it is possible, and we will plan for it." Samuel looked at his daughter across the supper table and said, "Whatever it takes." Clara nodded, as though this were the expected answer. James, who was 3 and had been following the conversation with the concentration of a person who is understanding about half of it and doing well regardless, said, "I want biscuits." "You can have biscuits and go to university," Edith told him. "Okay," he said, satisfied. The spring of 1883 brought a dry stretch that worried everyone on the land, the kind of dry that settles into the soil and cracks it and makes ranchers look at the sky with the focused anxiety of people whose lives are directly and continuously negotiated with the weather. Samuel managed it the way he managed difficult things, steadily, without panic, making the adjustments that could be made and accepting the ones that could not. Edith watched him and thought about resilience, the real kind, not the performative kind, the kind that is simply the ongoing choice to keep doing what needs doing without making a drama of it. They had a second child that year, a girl born in October, when the dry summer had finally broken into a golden fall. They named her Frances, after Edith's grandmother, and she arrived with the same emphatic loudness that James had brought to his entrance into the world, which Edith considered evidence of good lungs and strong opinions, both of which she approved of. Clara held Frances for the first time with the careful intensity she brought to all important things and said, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," James told her, with the authority of a 3-year-old who has been through this already. "I know that," Clara said, not looking up from the baby. Her expression was the fully open one, the one that bypassed her reserve entirely, the face of someone who is falling in love and knows it and does not mind. They were all right and better than all right. The ranch was solid. The school was thriving. Edith had extended her curriculum to include some natural science, inspired by years of answering Clara's questions, and she had written a letter to the Kansas State Education Board suggesting that this ought to be standard across the territory, and had received a reply indicating that her suggestion would be considered, which was bureaucratic language for not yet but possibly, which was sufficient for her purposes. Samuel and Edith had an argument in November of 1883 about the house, specifically about the addition he wanted to build, which she thought he was underestimating the cost of, and which he thought she was overcomplicating the planning of, and they disagreed about it with the directness that comes from genuine partnership, without the anxious tiptoeing of people who are not yet sure of each other. They resolved it in the way they resolved most things, by sitting down together with a piece of paper and working through the numbers until they arrived at a plan that both of them could endorse. And then he built the addition in the spring, and she acknowledged that it was exactly the right size, and he acknowledged that the extra window she had insisted on was in fact the correct choice, and that was that. The addition gave Clara a room that was entirely her own, which she immediately filled with her rocks and her books and her correspondence coursework, and several very detailed maps of places she intended to visit, and she would sit at her desk in the evenings doing her lessons in a pool of lamplight, and Samuel would look in on her sometimes through the half-open door, and have the same expression he had worn on the first day of school, watching her read that open, flooded thing, too full to contain. Except now the grief was not the primary note in it. Now it was mostly wonder. Edith knew he was doing it because she was usually a few steps behind him, and she would put her hand on his arm and they would look together for a moment before she pulled the door almost closed, and they went back to the kitchen and the ordinary evening. In 1885, Clara was 12 years old and working through a correspondence curriculum in mathematics that impressed the teacher in Abilene, enough that Dr. Flynn made a trip to Caldwell Creek specifically to meet her. She arrived on the stagecoach the same route, Edith thought, that she herself had arrived on 7 years before, and she was a brisk, sharp-eyed woman of 40 who shook Samuel's hand like an equal and told Clara that she had the mind of a mathematician and the patience of one, and that university was not only possible but necessary. Clara received this assessment with the composure of someone who had known it for years and was pleased to have it confirmed. Dr. Flynn had supper with them, and it was a good supper. Edith had been cooking well for years, which was a thing that had surprised her about herself, since she had not been particularly interested in cooking before and had been quite bad at it when she first arrived at the ranch. And they talked about education in the territory, and about what the next decade might bring, and about the particular challenges facing women who wanted to pursue academic careers. And Dr. Flynn talked about the injustice of it with a straightforward anger that Edith appreciated because she shared it. "The world is changing," Dr. Flynn said, "but too slowly and too conditionally. A woman must work twice as hard and ask permission for things a man would simply do, and this will be true for some time yet. Clara will be ready for it," Samuel said. Dr. Flynn looked at him with the slightly surprised expression of a woman who is not used to hearing that from fathers. "Yes," she said, "I believe she will be. The credit goes partly to her teacher." Edith shook her head. "Clara is her own doing, as all the best students are," Dr. Flynn agreed. "But they are helped along by people who see them accurately." Edith and Samuel looked at each other across the table, and the look said several things that the conversation did not. Frances was walking by 18 months and talking by 2 and had, by 3, developed an extremely strong personality that expressed itself primarily through an iron refusal to be deterred from whatever she had decided she was doing. She was a cheerful autocrat, Frances warm and funny, and absolutely inflexible once she had made up her mind, which Edith suspected she had inherited from multiple directions. James, who was 5 and had grown into a gentle, observant boy with a gift for animals, every creature he encountered seemed to immediately understand that he was trustworthy, treated Frances with the patient affection of a sibling who has realized that negotiation is more effective than confrontation, and adjusted accordingly. The family had become what it was, fully and without qualification. There were hard days when the weather was against them, or the money was tight, or one of the children was sick, or Samuel's old grief came up from wherever it lived and asked for acknowledgement. Edith learned to recognize the days when he needed space and the days when he needed to talk, and the days when he needed nothing except for her to be there, which she was, consistently and without drama, because that was what love looked like in a life lived rather than imagined. He was the same for her. When she received word in the spring of 1886 that her father had died, a letter from her youngest sister, delivered by the weekly mail, Samuel sat with her while she cried, which was not something she did easily or often, and held her hands and let her talk about her father, who had helped her pack when she left for Kansas, who had believed she was going somewhere worth going, who had never once suggested she might want to come back. "He would have liked you," she told Samuel. "Tell me why," he said in the low, careful voice. She told him. He listened with his whole attention, the way he always did, and asked the right questions. And by the end of it she was still sad, but had also added something to the record of her father that had not been there before, a kind of gratitude for the shape of the life he had helped make possible, which included everything currently around her. She wrote her mother and her sisters more frequently after that. In 1887, her youngest sister, Ada, came to visit, the first member of Edith's family to make the journey west, and stayed for 3 weeks, and reported back to Ohio that Edith was extremely well, and that the children were wonderful, and that Samuel Collier, though he was very quiet, was clearly the exact right person, and that the Kansas sky was in fact as large as Edith had described in her letters. Ada also told her privately that the life Edith had built looked nothing like anything she had expected, and exactly like everything Edith had always needed, which was something only a sister who had known you for 20 years could accurately observe. By 1888, Caldwell Creek had grown to nearly 500 people, which was still a small town, but was large enough that the school now had 2 rooms, and Edith had a teaching assistant, a young woman named Carrie Webb, who had come from Topeka, and who had the same honest enthusiasm for the work that Edith had brought 10 years before. Edith supervised and taught the older children while Carrie managed the younger ones, and the arrangement worked well, and Edith felt the specific satisfaction of having built something that would outlast her direct involvement with it. Clara, at 15, was the best student Edith had ever taught and possibly would ever teach. She had moved through the correspondence curriculum entirely and was now working, with Dr. Flynn's guidance, on preparatory material for university entrance. The question of which university was one that the family was actively addressing, because not all of them admitted women in 1888, and the ones that did were not always on the frontier, and there were arrangements to be made. "You will go," Edith told her, when Clara's face looked uncertain about it one evening. "Wherever is right, we will find it, and you will go. This is not a question." Clara looked at her father. "Papa, your mother said it is not a question," Samuel said. "I agree with your mother." Clara straightened her shoulders and nodded, and the uncertainty left her face and was replaced by her usual determined expression. And Edith looked at the word mother leaving Samuel's mouth as naturally as breathing, and felt, as she often did, that the world was a large and generous place that had brought her exactly where she was supposed to be. James, who was 8 in 1888, had by this point accumulated a menagerie that included 2 dogs, a mostly tame crow named Commissioner, and a rabbit he had rescued from a wire trap on the south fence and nursed back to health through a combination of careful feeding and what appeared to be earnest conversation. His father had inherited 2 quiet working dogs. James had inherited an entire parliament. Samuel managed this with the patience of a man who had long since accepted that certain facts of his household were simply facts. Frances, at 5, started school under Carrie Webb's instruction, and within 2 weeks had reorganized the classroom seating arrangement to her satisfaction, which Carrie Webb reported to Edith with an expression that was equal parts amusement and exasperation. And Edith said, "Yes, she does that," which was all the explanation required. The 10th anniversary of their wedding came in June of 1889. Samuel gave her a ring to replace the simple band she wore. She had never expected this, had not hinted at it, and the ring was not elaborate but was beautiful. A thin gold band set with a small green stone that was the color of sage in the morning, The color, he had said, quietly, reminded him of her eyes. She looked at it on her hand and looked at him and could not speak for a moment. 10 years, she said at last. 10 years, he agreed. He was looking at her with the expression that had stopped surprising her but never stopped moving her, the fully open one, the one without reserve, the one that was simply him looking at her. I want 20 more, she said. I want all of them, he said. She kissed him in the kitchen while the children were outside and the morning sun came through the window she had insisted on adding. And it was the kind of kiss that does not need to be anything other than what it is, not a beginning or an ending but a middle, the sustaining thing, the daily choice, the love that has been through ordinary life and emerged confirmed rather than diminished. In the fall of 1889, at 16, Clara Collier received a letter from a school in Boston that offered correspondence admission to women of exceptional academic standing, and she was 17 when she made the journey east, accompanied by Edith for the first part of the trip, and she cried once on the train, one careful controlled bout of tears that she had obviously been saving up, because Clara was not a crier as a rule, and Edith put her arm around her and held her and said, "You are going to do remarkable things." "I know," Clara said against her shoulder. "I just didn't know it would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like going and also like leaving," Clara said. "Yes," Edith said. "That is exactly what it is, both at once. That is how the best things tend to be." Clara left. The house was quieter. Samuel missed her with a specific, contained grief that was nothing like the grief he had carried before, not a wound but an absence. The way a room feels different when someone is not in it but will be again, the knowing kind of missing. Edith wrote to Clara twice a week. Clara wrote back almost as often, and her letters were a remarkable document full of ideas and observations and descriptions of Boston that made it sound like a foreign country, which in some respects it was, and also full of, between the lines of all the intellectual excitement, a homesickness that she was clearly managing rather than surrendering to, which was exactly what Edith had hoped she would do. James, at 10, had become his father's shadow on the ranch in the way that is not imitation but affinity, the natural alignment of two people who love the same kind of work. He was learning everything Samuel could teach him, and Samuel taught him with the same patient seriousness he brought to all important things. On the evenings when the work was done, Samuel would sometimes read aloud to James from the shelves that had always held Edith's books alongside his own, and Edith would sit and do her school preparation, and listen to his voice, and feel the rightness of everything with such completeness that it occasionally required a moment to be just that, without other demands. Frances, at 7, had opinions about her future. They changed regularly and dramatically. She wanted to be a doctor on Monday, a horse trader on Wednesday, and on Friday she announced that she was going to be a judge, which no one in the family discouraged because none of them were in any position to argue with her when she was decided. And besides, by 1890, the idea of women in professional life was no longer quite the impossibility it had been. The new decade arrived and life continued to be lived, which is its own kind of grace. There were good years and hard years and years that were both at once. There was a drought in 1892 that required real sacrifice, and Samuel made the adjustments without complaint, and Edith cut back on school supplies and made do with what they had. And when it was over, they were still standing, still there together. There were good harvests that followed and lean ones too, and all of it was the reality of the life they had chosen, which was not a life without difficulty, but a life in which difficulty did not get the final word. Clara came home for the first time at Christmas of 1891, having completed a year and a half of study, and she was subtly different, more confident, if that was possible, and with a precision of language that had always been there but was now sharper and more deliberate. She was also more clearly herself than she had ever been, as though the distance from home had given her room to take up the shape she had always been growing toward. She and Samuel sat on the porch on a cold December evening, the two of them bundled in coats, and talked for 2 hours while Edith put the younger children to bed. When Edith came out with coffee, the conversation had wound down to a comfortable quiet, and Clara was leaning against her father's shoulder in the way she had not done since she was very small, and Samuel had his arm around her, and his face in the clear winter air was wholly at peace. "Good evening," Edith said, giving them each a cup. "Miss Lawson," Clara said, an old joke, one they had been making for years. "Miss Collier," Edith replied, and sat in her chair and pulled her coat close, and the three of them sat in the cold night under the Kansas stars, which were extraordinary in December, too many to count, a whole sky of them from horizon to horizon. "I was right," Clara said after a long quiet. "About what?" her father said. "About it being all right," Clara said. "Back on the first day of school when I was worried, you said it would be all right. You were right." "I usually am," Samuel said mildly. Clara turned and looked at Edith. "You made it all right," she said, with the directness that had been part of her since she was 5 years old, asking if she could call someone Mama. "I want you to know that I know that." Edith set her coffee cup on the arm of her chair and said, "You are going to make me cry, Clara Collier." "Good," Clara said without apology. "You deserve to." Edith did cry, a little in the warm, private way that is not distress but its opposite, the body's response to something that is simply too full not to spill over. Samuel reached across and took her hand and held it, which was what he had always done and would always do, and the night went on around them, large and cold and full of stars. Clara returned to Boston in January and finished her studies and came back in 1894 with credentials that made Mayor Finch, who was older now and slower but still round-faced and enthusiastic, shake her hand with both of his and say that the town was very proud, which was true. She did not stay in Caldwell Creek. She had been offered a position at a school in Topeka, and she took it, and that was right and proper, and exactly what Edith had always intended her preparation to lead to. The distance from Caldwell Creek to Topeka was manageable, and Clara came home 4 times a year, and she wrote often, and the shape of the family changed as families do when children become adults without any of the essential thing being lost. James, 17 in 1897, had the ranch in his blood in the same way that Clara had mathematics. It was simply his, the thing he was meant for, and he was already doing much of the daily management work, learning the business of it from his father, and Samuel taught him with the pride of a man who is handing something real to someone who will honor it. Frances, 14, was working her way through every book in the school and had recently started corresponding with Dr. Flynn in Abilene, who had by now met every academically determined member of the Collier family and seemed to consider them a personal project. Frances had decided for the present that she wanted to be an educator, which struck Edith as exactly right in a way that went down through her chest and into her bones. "She's going to be better than me," Edith told Samuel one evening. "Unlikely," he said. "Don't argue with a professional," she said. "She has your instincts," he said. "She will do something extraordinary with them. That reflects on the source." She looked at him. "When did you get so articulate?" "I have always been articulate," he said, with the mildness that meant he was pleased. "I was just selective." They had been married 18 years by then, and the house was full in the way that good houses get full, not just with people but with evidence of the life lived in them. The accumulation of books and repairs and mended things and children's drawings that had never quite been thrown away, and a particular dent in the kitchen table from the time James dropped the iron horseshoe he was not supposed to be carrying inside. And the window that the November light came through in a specific way that Edith loved, and had loved since the first winter she spent in this house. She had stopped being the schoolteacher from Ohio a long time ago. She was Edith Collier, and Caldwell Creek was hers in the same way it was Samuel's, not owned, because land in Kansas will quickly demonstrate that it answers to nobody, but claimed and inhabited and loved in the specific way of someone who chose to be there and kept choosing it every season, every year. In the spring of 1898, Samuel turned 51. She threw him a supper party that got slightly out of hand and ended with most of the town council on the porch and Mayor Finch, who was getting genuinely old now, asleep in the good chair by the fire, which everyone tactfully did not mention. Clara came from Topeka. James and Francis were there. Ruth Garcia, who was a grandmother 3 times over, came and ate everything in sight and said she would leave only when they told her to. Samuel sat in the middle of all of it with Edith beside him and looked around at his house full of people, the people he had fed and fixed fences for and lent horses to, and talked to in the dark years, when talking was the only thing that helped, and he was, unmistakably and without reservation, happy. Not the provisional happiness of someone waiting for the other boot to drop, but the deep-settled kind that comes from having built something real and seen it hold. Edith took his hand under the table because she could see what was on his face, and he squeezed hers once firmly and turned and looked at her. "All right," she said. "Yes," he said. "Very much yes." She taught in Caldwell Creek until 1902, when she handed the school over to Francis, who had returned from her own training in Topeka with credentials and methods, and a force of will that made Edith feel the school was in better hands than it had ever been in. This was the kind of thing that could be both true and also something that required a private cry at the kitchen table, which Samuel sat through without making it worse, passing her his handkerchief and waiting. "I built something," she said eventually. "You built several things," he said. "The school was real," she said. "It is still real," he said. "It has not stopped existing. It has passed to your daughter." She looked at him. "She is our daughter." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "She is." She wiped her eyes and blew her nose and straightened up and said, "Well, I have more time now. I have been meaning to actually read everything on those shelves for 15 years. You can start tomorrow," he said. "I am starting today," she said. The years did what years do. They continued, which is the most important thing they can do. James married a level-headed young woman named Harriet Bowen in 1901, and they had a son in 1902 and a daughter in 1904, and they lived in the house on the ranch. A new wing added for the expanded household, and Samuel worked alongside his son with the ease of men who share a language of work, who understand what the other is going to do before he does it. Francis ran the school with conviction and brilliance, and made certain changes that Edith privately agreed with and publicly stayed out of, because the school was Francis's now, and that was the right order of things. She did, one afternoon in 1903, stop by the schoolhouse on her way back from town and stand in the doorway and look at the room. The map still on the wall, different map but the same kind. The book still along the windowsill, the same deliberate temptation. And she felt every morning she had stood at the front of this room, and every child who had looked back at her with the alive expression that means something is landing, something is connecting, and she thought that it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been extraordinary. Clara wrote every week still. She had published a paper in a mathematics journal in 1900 that had caused a small sensation in academic circles that made it to Caldwell Creek in the form of a letter from Dr. Flynn, saying that she always knew, and a letter from Clara herself, saying that the sensation was minor, and she was already working on something more interesting. She had not married, and Edith had never asked her about it, because some people are complete in ways that do not require that particular arrangement, and Clara had always seemed to Edith to be one of them, full, purposeful, thoroughly herself. Samuel and Edith were alone together in the evenings now, which was a new kind of togetherness, quieter, more spacious, after all those years of children and noise and the specific busyness of a full house. They sat on the porch in the summer evenings and watched the light go out of the sky, that gradual western departure that goes from gold to amber to blue to dark over the course of an hour if you pay attention, and they paid attention. "I have been thinking," Edith said one evening in the summer of 1905, with the sky going amber and the horses in the near field, and the sound of Harriet's baby from inside the house where the young family lived. "Tell me, Samuel said. "When I got off that stagecoach in 1878, she said, I had a carpet bag and a trunk of books and a letter saying I was the school teacher. I was so certain I knew what I was coming to do. And," he said, "and I was right," she said. "I just did not know all of it yet." She paused. "The teaching was only part of it. It was the part I had planned. The rest of it I found." He was looking at her in the amber light with the expression she had loved and studied for 26 years and still found new in it. "You found us," he said. "You were easy to find," she said, which was not quite true, and they both knew it, and it did not matter. The evening went on to dark. They sat together in it, the way they had sat together in all the evenings that had preceded this one, which were more than she could count, which were more than she would ever want to count, because counting them would imply a limit, and she did not want limits. She wanted the ongoing thing, the continuous, particular, irreplaceable thing that was her life with this man in this place on this rolling piece of prairie under this enormous sky. "Samuel," she said. "Edith," he said. There was nothing in particular to say after that. There did not need to be. In the years that followed, Caldwell Creek grew and changed, as all things grow and change, and the school that Edith Lawson had arrived to teach became something larger and better than what she had found, and the ranch that Samuel Collier had worked alone through the hard years became something that held 3 generations. Clara wrote a second paper, and a third, and eventually a book, and sent a copy to Edith with a note on the flyleaf that said, simply, "Everything I am, I was given room to be." James's children grew up and learned the land the way he had, and Francis taught in Caldwell Creek for 30 years and was remembered there the way good teachers are remembered, not as a figure of authority, but as the person who showed someone what they were capable of. And Samuel and Edith Collier grew old together in the house on the East Ridge, with the window that the morning light came through, and the bookshelves that had always had too many books for the space available, and the wooden box with the carved open book on the lid that sat on her writing table for as long as she lived, holding the things that mattered most. He had raised his daughter alone, in the quiet and the difficulty of that, and she had come for a teaching position with a carpet bag and a trunk and the intention of being useful, and what happened instead, or alongside, or because of, was the story of 2 people who found in each other the specific and irreplaceable thing that cannot be planned for, only recognized, and then held carefully, and kept. That was what she had found when she knocked on his door with a folded letter and a question about his daughter. That was what he had found when he opened it. Everything else was the living of it, which was the whole point. The living of it was the whole and sufficient point.